Hello and welcome to Refugee Communities in Olmsted County. Information for child welfare and county professionals. This module has been assembled by Will Carlson and Dr. Patricia Shannon of the University of Minnesota School of Social Work for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. Work that is supported by federal Title IV-E funds from the Minnesota Department of Human Service, Children and Family Services Division. This module was constructed specifically based on feedback we received from county practitioners regarding specific county needs and available services for refugees in Olmsted County. The components of this module were assembled with feedback from county providers and include explaining the distinct features of refugee status and what exactly this means, looking at refugee resettlement by numbers and demographics in Olmsted County, understanding common refugee experiences for most persons who meet the definition, and how this information can have implications for your practice considerations with refugee families. Research findings from a program of local research examining relevant dynamics and challenges for child welfare and county professionals working with refugee families. A brief exploration of culturally relevant information and historical context to improve county professionals' knowledge of the Somali community, Olmsted County's largest refugee community, and local resources that may help facilitate stronger connections between Olmsted County workers and Somali families, as well as cultural considerations for difficult interactions. Let's start off by talking about what a refugee is. Per the United States Immigration and Nationality Act, a refugee is a person who has crossed an international border from their home country into a second country, seeking refuge from persecution. The term refugee officially refers to a legal immigration status that applies to individuals who've been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution based on factors of race, religion, nationality, stated political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees report from this June 2022, there are currently approximately 27.1 million refugees worldwide. There are generally three options available to people who qualify as refugees. They can wait until the persecution in their own country has ended and return to their homes. They can integrate into their country of refuge, the country that they fled to, or they can be resettled into a third country, usually a Western country in Europe or North America. The UN High Commission for Refugees is responsible for most refugee situations and works with refugee camps and receiving countries to help with refugee resettlement. In the U.S., refugee families are resettled into their new homes through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The importance of understanding refugee status, in addition to it providing helpful context for a family's past experiences and implications for your practice, is that refugees are entitled to additional benefits during their initial resettlement period through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The benefits extended through the Office of Refugee Resettlement for the first 8 months that families are in the U.S. include refugee cash assistance, access to medical assistance, and access to food assistance. Now that we know the status criteria and benefits associated with refugee status, let's look more specifically at Olmsted County's refugee communities. As we can see, there's been growth to Olmsted County's refugee community over the past 10 years. While we can observe recent disruptions in community growth over the past few years, these reflect national decreases associated with administrative changes in U.S. policy, which have been largely reversed under the new administration. Continued growth is expected. It's important to note that the numbers on this graph are associated with primary arrivals. These are refugees that are resettled directly into Olmsted County from a foreign refugee situation. There's also something called secondary arrival, where refugees move to Olmsted County after having been previously resettled elsewhere in the U.S. Although harder to track, secondary arrival is important to consider. It was noted in interviews with Olmsted County providers as worthy of extra investigation to determine remaining benefits eligibility. Because movement is much harder to track than arrival, secondary arrival often contributes to a significant increase in counties' refugee numbers. When we look at the cumulative impact of primary resettlement, we can see steep changes in Olmsted County's refugee community, indicative of potential rapid growth in the future. While Olmsted County has a remarkably diverse refugee community, the largest contingent is made up of refugees from Somalia. Other refugee communities are ordered on this slide in order of size. These include refugees from Iraq, Oromo refugees from Ethiopia, refugees from Sudan, and refugees from Bhutan, Burma, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Syria. Of additional note is a recent influx of humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan to the state of Minnesota. Minnesota recently received 1,260 Afghans on humanitarian parole through Operation Allies Welcome. The benefits of humanitarian parole make refugee benefits available to these families, but will require them to work through the legal process of asylum in order to remain in the U.S. going forward. Of particular note is the unfortunate detail that any interaction with law enforcement or an open case with CPS will disqualify these families from receiving asylum. While the experiences of individual families vary by culture and country of origin, something we will talk more specifically about later, there are some general considerations related to resettlement eligibility and the resettlement process that are a helpful starting place when thinking about working with refugee families. For starters, scholars have described the impact of the refugee experience by referring to the stages that affect all refugees' adjustment in resettlement. What refugees experience pre-flight, during flight, and in refugee camps or cities of refuge will continue to impact them once they are finally resettled. While it is important to note that individual experiences and the effects of these experiences depend on the specific economic, social, and cultural conditions for each phase of the refugee experience, as well as the unique characteristics of each individual, it is helpful when working with refugees to understand a bit about what is generally involved in each phase in more detail. Let's look at that now. The pre-flight period refers to experiences that refugees face in their home country that lead to their decision to flee. By definition, refugees are people who have fled persecution in their country of origin and are unable to return. Thus, the pre-flight period for all refugees is one that is characterized by sociopolitical violence, oppression, and unrest. Many of the home countries of refugees in the U.S. have a long history of war and sociopolitical conflicts, during which refugees experienced torture, rape, arbitrary detention, arbitrary seizure of property, ongoing surveillance, and murder, execution, and disappearances of loved ones. Other experiences can include additional physical or sexual violence, witnessing death or violence, detention, forced labor, economic deprivation, food shortages, illness, malnutrition, as well as the curtailment of rights such as freedom of expression, freedom to assemble, and importantly, arbitrary, unjustified arrests. All of these tactics used by governments and groups in power are intended to perpetrate fear and induce feelings of powerlessness. Experiences of war trauma and torture have been shown to be associated with psychosocial problems in refugee populations that can have negative impacts on family functioning. They are also incredibly important context for understanding families' worry or wariness of child welfare professionals or people seen as representing the government generally. The period of flight is the experience of migration from one's home country to the country of their first asylum. Refugees are often forced to leave their home with little preparation, on foot, and with few provisions. Refugees may walk for weeks or months to get to safety, are commonly separated from family members during this period, which includes extreme danger and ongoing threat of harm. The statement at the bottom of this slide from a Mozambican refugee interviewed in 1991 describes a common experience endured by refugees. My own house was burning as I ran from it, leaving all of my possessions behind. All of my family managed to get away, but we were separated in the confusion. Over the next few days, we were gradually united, and we then began to travel towards the border. We took quiet routes by day and hid in the bush at night. During the reception phase, refugees spend time in limbo in their first country of refuge. By definition, all refugees have crossed an international border. They often seek shelter in a camp or in an urban area and register with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who may provide some basic relief items. While in the camps, refugees continue to face a lack of safety. Women are also vulnerable to sexual violence in this stage, especially if they must leave the camp to collect provisions and necessities, such as firewood. Further compounding stress is the reality that refugees often do not have documents to live legally in their country of first asylum, and they face continued fear of deportation back to their unsafe home country. Refugee camp conditions are often characterized by poor sanitation, poor access to nutritious food, poor health care, and limited educational and employment opportunities. Thus, there are observed health consequences associated with prolonged asylum. The UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, defines a protracted refugee situation as one in which 25,000 or more refugees of the same nationality have been in exile for 5 years or longer. Currently, 2/3 of refugees have lived in a qualifying protracted situation at some time. Finally, because of their lack of status, refugees are unable to leave the camp or legally work in their area of asylum. So they are forced to be dependent on outside aid to meet basic needs. To the extent that refugees are excluded from decision-making that affects their lives, this may also facilitate attitudes of learned helplessness and increase the likelihood of depression. The next phase is resettlement. The goal of the United States Resettlement Program is that refugees will become economically self-sufficient as soon as possible after they arrive. All refugees are assigned to a voluntary agency who provides initial reception and placement services, which include pre-arrival preparations for new families. In Minnesota, these organizations include Arrive Ministries, Catholic Charities, the International Institute of Minnesota, Lutheran Social Services, the Minnesota Council of Churches, and others. With legal refugee status, refugees are also eligible for public services and assistance upon their arrival. It is important to note that in addition to the traumas experienced in their home countries during pre-flight and flight, research has found that refugee families experience significant stressors related to the resettlement and acculturation process. These stressors can impact their family functioning and parenting practices, and many of these stressors are identified as risk factors for involvement with CPS in the general population. Common resettlement stressors include language barriers, discrimination, social isolation from their communities, poverty, changing family and gender roles, particularly when the culture in which a family resettles is significantly different than their culture of origin, health and mental health needs related to pre-flight and flight traumas and resettlement stressors, and notably, a loss of occupational credentials. This one is particularly important in the U.S. context, as the United States has some of the strictest criteria globally for transferring previously gained education and credentials. In addition to a changing professional role and identity, refugee families often experience stress from changing family and gender roles that result from influence of social norms in their country of resettlement. Employment opportunities, or lack thereof, and differences in language acquisition and acculturation among parents and children can result in feelings of loss of parenting authority and control over their children. The cumulative impact of these stressors, particularly when coupled with trauma experiences during flight and pre-flight, may result in an elevated need for health and mental health support. Other resettlement stressors regularly observed when working with refugees include unsafe or unstable housing, significant social isolation, and the profound impact of stress from back home, particularly when a refugee has family members who still live in their country of origin or in unsafe conditions, and especially when refugees are coming from a context considered newsworthy and thus represented regularly in U.S. media. Of note, post-migration stressors are actually most strongly associated with ongoing psychological hardship and functional difficulties. Daily stressors moderate the impact of war trauma on long-term mental health outcomes for refugees, and multiple post-migration stressors negatively impact long-term adjustment. So we can see how these resettlement stressors accumulate and multiply and add to the amount of stress families are under. With refugee families in particular, we cannot talk about stressors without also discussing strengths. Although migration and resettlement involve significant challenges, refugee families display significant strengths and protective factors that can support psychological well-being, social adjustment, and positive family functioning. The most obvious strength of refugee families is their evidenced ability to protect their children through extraordinary circumstances. As previously discussed, families with refugee status have had to navigate extraordinarily dangerous conditions in their countries of origin and during their migration to the U.S. Their ability to keep their children safe and their families intact under these incredibly trying conditions is a significant show of strength. Additionally, refugee families demonstrate resilience, resourcefulness, and strong commitment to their children by choosing migration from their home countries in order to provide their children with a better future. Another considerable strength are families' strong social supports. Although they had to leave their social connections in their countries of origin, many refugees develop strong social connections within their refugee communities they settle in the U.S. These communities provide strong social supports for many families. A further resource for some refugee families are traditional religious or cultural values that can be protective factors against resettlement stressors and protect against potential sources of child abuse. Given the significant evidenced resilience of refugee families and the impactful role of the resettlement environment, we wanted to look at county family and children systems that interact with refugee families. This work started with the CPS involvement and response study, which looked at rates, outcomes, and documentation for CPS cases involving refugee children. Interestingly, while out-of-home placement rates were similar to other CPS-involved kids, placement setting was significantly different for refugee children. More refugee kids were in non-relative foster homes, and more than 50%, in fact almost 55%, were in restrictive settings. Notably, half of placements for Somali children were in residential facilities. Also important in the documentation was that there were more documented strengths in CPS records for Somali families than there were for other refugee groups. There were also patterns in the documented needs, which frequently included increased social support, concerns about mental health, and the vast need for alternative parenting skills education. Using the CPS involvement and response study as a launchpad, we then conducted a series of interviews with both refugee community leaders and child welfare practitioners in order to better understand this data and dig into some of the unique experiences of both refugee families and the CPS providers who work with them. In 2019 and 2020, we conducted interviews with cultural leaders and CPS workers from Hennepin, Ramsey, Anoka, Dakota, Kandiyohi, Olmsted, and Rice County. Participants identified as white, black, Asian, multiracial, and African, and reported working with families from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and South America. The themes we are about to cover were collected from a series of interviews with social service professionals and community leaders from local refugee communities, specifically aimed at identifying and addressing ways to improve these working relationships. The information that follows was pulled directly from repeating themes observed throughout the collection of interviews. Videos of our interviews with cultural leaders can be found on the CASHU website in the Resource Library tab, or by using the site's search function and inputting refugee as your search term. Above are the 4 resulting themes that came up many times in our interviews with refugee community leaders. The main issues identified by community leaders were refugee communities' lack of awareness of the mission and goals of CPS. The second theme focused on the role of parental authority in the resettlement process and how role changes and shifts in family dynamic affected by resettlement impact considerations for CPS practitioners working with refugee families. Third, the significance of lingering learned distrust of government actors from refugees' past experience with persecution that caused them to flee their homes was repeatedly cited as having important and unique implications to CPS involvement with refugee families. The final theme emerged related to the lack of proposed alternatives. That is, when parents are only told what not to do, it's hard to know what they can do. This can lead to feelings of helplessness, uncertainty, and powerlessness. Let's dig into these themes a bit more from each perspective. We'll start with lack of awareness about CPS. So because of the uniqueness of Child Protective Services to the United States, many refugee families aren't familiar with CPS, and resettlement education doesn't generally address it. Additionally, the information they are able to get often comes from informal communication with community members, which may not be accurate and can certainly increase parents' fears about CPS. So, it is incredibly important when working with a family to explain the mission and values of CPS, emphasizing the child welfare system's appreciation for family relationships and prioritization of keeping the family intact whenever possible. Additionally, further education about how CPS works to provide resources and steps towards reunification when separation is necessary is central to building a trusting relationship with refugee families. This lack of knowledge about CPS and child protection-related laws also came up in our discussions with CPS workers, particularly related to knowledge about supervision requirements and education requirements. So I just wanted to include this quote to show that these problems are widely recognized on both sides of the system and highlight this congruence. See, for example, this quote from one of the CPS workers we talked to when we asked about how refugee families get involved with CPS in the first place. Their response cites that not understanding screening criteria and U.S. laws about child supervision are often root causes of families' involvement with the system. This particular practitioner emphasized the need for further one-on-one education in these cases. Theme 2. Undermining adult authority. Remembering back to our resettlement stressor slide, we saw that many of the stressors both resulted from and contributed to changing family roles and the loss of adult identity and authority. This becomes particularly salient as it relates to children's progress with resettlement and assimilation as compared to their parents. In general, children acquire language and culture much more quickly than their parents due to a variety of social and developmental factors. Special consideration of these dynamics is beneficial to a good working relationship with guardians. Validating efforts and obstacles and explicitly stating and showing respect for parents in their family roles should be regularly considered and prioritized when working with refugee families. Additionally, be sure to consider the associated frustrations or disempowerment related to not being able to advocate for oneself on matters related to their family, particularly after parents have faced cumulative hardships to ensure the health and safety of their family. Issues of disempowerment and adult authority were often related to communication and language barriers. The complexities of communication, knowledge, and authority interact in many different ways through all of the systems with which refugee families interact. For instance, knowing about how to call their child an absent isn't always communicated clearly, which can lead to a truancy referral. Because these barriers are not just associated with words, but rather with culturally based concepts of parenting and specific U.S. law, it is important to take a broader perspective on the role of interpretation. Many of the county practitioners we talked to stressed the role of interpreters as cultural liaisons. Through our continued exploration, we repeatedly heard evidence of the particular benefit to expanding our consideration for interpretation as a process. It's not merely language translation, but a nuanced task with immense relational potential. Child welfare practitioners across counties talked about the difference that could be made through in-person interpretation when at all possible, and by leveraging interpreters' cultural knowledge as well as language abilities during these interactions. The multi-layer benefits of having a strong relationship with an interpreter are summed up in this final quote here at the bottom. Not only am I doing the translation between languages, I'm interpreting what these systems are, what the laws and policies are. The beneficial role also has relational dimensions, as represented in this first quote. One of the central challenges of working with refugee families as a child welfare provider is working with families who have a learned distrust of government actors. So as we discussed, by definition, refugee parents have encountered persecution or direct threat of persecution. Many of the pre-flight conditions families come from include occurrences like the threat or delivery of arbitrary punishment, arrest, detainment, physical harm, and particularly relevant for CPS, the sudden disappearance of loved ones. Here I'll emphasize the words arbitrary and sudden. So when we consider this context, the concerns related to the potential removal of children by CPS that all parents feel when interacting with the system takes on a new meaning. Thus, it is extremely important to distinguish yourself from other government actors such as police, and to make clear the transparent processes, procedures, and priorities related to your work with families. It has been shown to be especially necessary to take some time establishing relational trust with refugee families in particular, by asking them first about themselves and their family history, and explaining your role within CPS, the role of CPS as an organization, and the limits to CPS's authority. When asked what something concrete welfare workers could do to show care and respect for refugee parents, one of the responses we got was, "Do not cut us short. Let us speak." It is common for refugee parents to want to be understood in the context of their journey. While time pressures are a frequently cited barrier to these types of relational interactions, the implications for honesty, openness, and follow-through and ongoing communication seem certainly worth the investment. The role of fear of government as a barrier came up frequently in conversations with welfare and county professionals. As this provider stated, I just think they obviously have additional challenges. For example, being fearful of government in particular, being very nervous about our involvement, I would say, causes extra stress on families. So we definitely have to have conversations about that from the get-go, as far as what our goal in child protection is, and that we don't have authority over some of those issues, like their status, for example. Other providers again referenced the important role of a cultural liaison, or the benefit of including additional, extended, or chosen family members of that culture when possible. The final theme is that parents feel helpless when they lack alternative solutions. This is both particularly important and somewhat difficult to think about when you are of the dominant culture because you don't have to learn what you already know. So it can be particularly difficult for child welfare workers to approach their area of expertise from the perspective of someone completely unfamiliar with child welfare laws or the concept of child protection. Similar to the first theme concerning knowledge about CPS, it is important to remember what parents might not know when you're working with them. When parents are only given the message of what they cannot or should not do, or what will get them into trouble, there's the potential to inadvertently increase parents' anxiety, fear, or feelings of helplessness. To avoid this, try to be sure to include possible pathways to remediate or avoid the problems you might be addressing. And get specific. The United States in particular has some very specific laws about what is and is not abuse. Think about the threshold between abuse and discipline. Naming this as a cultural difference in the United States and explaining what terms like abuse mean is essential to establishing a common understanding for communicating with families and establishing trust. This also circles back to language because it is entirely possible that you are using English words differently. So being very specific about the types of behaviors you're referring to can give parents a more complete understanding of what you're talking about. Be clear in how you communicate this and offer alternative practices to allow parents to enforce structure and safety within their families and encourage them to continue to parent. What we have found is often parents hear that they shouldn't do anything. So you shouldn't discipline your child this way is received as you cannot discipline your child at all. This is where it's very helpful to have specific examples of alternatives for parenting support. So our working models in the US of how we approach behavior modification and sustaining cultural parental authority while using new methods of discipline. So returning to our larger thematic findings, it appears that the primary reasons most refugee families get involved with CPS in the first place are grounded in cultural knowledge and practices. And differences in this were based on county-specific factors. So factors of geography, local resources, the demography of local refugee populations, and staff experiences. These findings are central to our motivation for creating this training module, and particularly the inclusion of our next section, which will examine more specifically what these elements look like currently in Olmsted County. As previously mentioned, the ethnic community most represented in Olmsted County's refugee population are from Somalia. So, let's use the rest of our time to talk a little bit more about the Somali community specifically. When working with refugees, it is always helpful to have a little bit of knowledge about the history and political background from where they come. Somali civilians have for many years been caught in the middle of a chaotic and violent struggle for control of Somalia. Studies show that Somali refugees report a torture exposure rate of 36%. According to the UN High Commission for Refugees, in 2016 there were over 2.5 million registered Somali refugees and Somalis living in refugee-like situations worldwide. Most Somali refugees flee to refugee camps in neighboring countries like Kenya and Ethiopia to await resettlement. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that over half of all Somali refugees worldwide are residing in temporary refugee camps. Over the last 3 decades, 90,000 Somali refugees have migrated to the United States, with over 42,000 residing in Minnesota. Somalis have established a large and vibrant community in Minneapolis and have established businesses, schools, and centers to serve their community. Unlike some new refugee communities, the Somali community in Minnesota is long established. Children who came to the U.S. at a very young age or were born here to refugee parents may identify more with American culture, and cultural gaps between generations can be significant. Despite the presence of established and growing resettled communities, Somali refugees continue to experience social, mental, and physical health disparities. Important Cultural background includes that Somali society is organized into ancestral clans, with membership being determined by father's lineage. It cannot be overstated that family is extremely important in Somalia. In a Somali home, the father is traditionally the wage earner and decision maker for the family in public. If the father is absent, this role is usually passed to an older male relative. Women in Somali families have significant influence in the home, and their status may be elevated by the number of children they have. Children are highly valued in Somali culture. Most Somalis arriving in Minnesota are Sunni Muslims, and the practice of Islam is an integral part of life. According to Islamic tradition, women and men do not touch members of the opposite sex outside of the family, such as shaking hands. Awareness of these gender expectations and norms of cross-cultural gender, social, and communication practices can ease relationship building when working with Somali families and start you off on the right foot. Within the community, the Somali language is universally spoken, with Arabic as a common second language. Centrally important is that Somali families often rely on large family systems of care with multi-generational support for raising children. So if they're disconnected from family because of displacement, this can be especially hard. It may be helpful to acknowledge this potential grief related to separation from extended family. Additionally, it may help to suggest utilizing a collaborative approach and use or include chosen extended family whenever possible. Because of the importance of family, it is essential to emphasize that CPS's goal is to keep children with their immediate family and caregivers as much as is possible. Additionally, we recommend you highlight the supportive role of CPS to help a family regain continuity if separation becomes likely. Of further importance is understanding the connection of discipline and power dynamics. It is especially helpful in this community for CPS workers to empower parents by explaining the detailed differences between discipline and abuse under U.S. law. We've included this collection of advice from focus groups that were held with Somalis related to questions about how to approach subjects of mental health and functioning in a culturally appropriate way. I want to emphasize the focus on connecting pain to the histories that are causing them. Talking about personal family history and the politics back home. Linking difficulties to past and current stressors. And explicitly asking about hardships. It should again be emphasized that trained interpreters as cultural liaisons or allyship with the extended family is particularly helpful for these conversations. Before we focus on local community resources, we wanted to provide you with these general information resources. Bridging Refugee Youth and Child Services has a wide range of frequently updated materials available. We've chosen here to emphasize materials about positive youth development in the Somali community and family strengthening, but there's a wide range of resources available at brycs.org. For the Somali community, the Confederation of Somali Community in Minnesota is a particularly helpful resource. In addition to the general resources, Olmsted County is fortunate to have some wonderful local resources. The IMAA provides a variety of services, including health and wellness education, health insurance case management, and education about health insurance, service connection, referral, and care coordination within the community, informal counseling and support, language and interpreting services, job placement and interview preparation services, as well as career counseling. Of additional note, they have a community events calendar listed on their website that's worth a look, and their staff work with local organizations to provide additional professional trainings. Somali Community Resettlement Services can assist new arrivals with documentation, systems navigation, school registration, and legal issues. They also provide healthy living classes, counseling referrals, English language education, housing, transportation, and energy assistance, as well as career counseling and job placement. Partnering with these community organizations may provide a helpful pathway for improving the county's working relationship with the local Somali community. Additionally, Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services is another great resource for free legal assistance. This concludes our training for today. Thank you for your time and attention.